Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynica, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians and friends of Ukraine around the world. Today is Tuesday, February 10th, 2026. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is the economist Timothy Ash, who is an associate fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House in the UK, and a senior sovereign strategist at RBC Blue Bay Asset Management in London. Welcome, Tim. How are you?
Good, great to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. Can you tell us a bit about your professional career to start off with?
Yes, so I started off in Soviet studies in the late 80s, and I did a bit on Soviet agriculture at the time. That was before the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was looking on a project, a research project at Exeter University, looking at technological change in Soviet agriculture. Um, Went on from that, did like 4 years postgrad stuff on the Soviet Union, economics, agriculture, and then transition as the Soviet Union collapsed and the Warsaw Pact collapsed. I did a lot of stuff on transition economics. Worked at the Economist Intelligence Unit for a bit, doing macro forecasts, and then 1997 joined a bank and worked. I worked for 20 odd years in banking as an economist, looking mostly on fixed income, so looking at countries' debt. I did that for like 20 years, mostly looking at emerging Europe, including Ukraine, and then for the last 8 years, or 9 years, I've been at RBC Blue Bay. It's a Canadian-owned asset manager. Globally, we manage about $700 billion. We invest many countries globally, including Ukraine, US, Turkey, lots of different places. I've covered Ukraine. I guess I first went to Kiev in 88. I lived in Ukraine for a year in the 1990s, working for the European Union, and I must have done hundreds of research trips to Ukraine over the years.
And can you tell us a bit about Chatham House and its work?
Yeah, so it's the Royal Institute of International Affairs. It's a think tank that focuses on foreign affairs mostly. As I said, I'm on the Russia and Eurasia program. There's been lots of debate about changing that particular name. It's been difficult internally to get agreement, but basically, I'm part of a lot of my focus there is Russia, Ukraine, but I do the wider region as well. That's a unpaid part-time profession or job. My main job is working as an asset manager. So that is RBC Blue Bay. That's advising portfolio managers where to invest, particularly in terms of again fixed income markets.
And why did you come to specialize in Ukraine's economy, politics, and the ongoing Russian war?
Oh well, I don't know. It's for some reason. I mean, I've no historical. There's no family relationship. I'm not married to a Ukrainian. I guess I had an interest in, the Soviet Union and its history, and then obviously that collapsed. And for some reason, over the last 30 years or so, more than 30 years, I've always had some interface with Ukraine. Right. I mean, it's always been around the economy. I think few people have covered it as long as me and as in much detail as me. I kind of, in life, you take opportunities as they come, and you fill gaps and vacuums, and you go with the flow. And I guess that's been my story in Ukraine. I like writing. I mean, I'm quite a prolific writer, and I guess I write quite strategically, quite shorter articles looking at specific problems, economics, but also geopolitics, and I guess as someone who has been passionate about the reform story in Ukraine over the years and trying to support the reform story in Ukraine. Living through the Orange Revolution, Euromaidan, and then obviously annexation of Crimea and first Russian intervention in Donbass in 2014. You end up kind of living and breathing a story. I mean, I do think that Ukraine's victory in this war and its successful economic transformation is mission critical for Europe. Actually, I'm passionate about that. I think Russia is an existential threat to Europe. Ukraine is the front line for us. It's defending European values and our interests. So again, I guess that's a lot what I write around, for me, it's black and white, right? I mean, I know a lot of people say it's kind of grey areas, but for me, this has been good versus evil. It's clear cut. It's there's no blurry lines on this. Russia is clearly the aggressor. It's interesting. I had a discussion. I had lunch yesterday with a friend who's a Lebanese friend, and he was arguing the usual thing that where did Ukraine go wrong? Couldn't Zelensky have done something different to stop the full scale invasion? Wasn't there a deal over NATO? And I just remember back to Euromaidan, and in the end, this has never been about NATO expansion. Interestingly, that Russia's been meddling in Ukrainian economics and policy for a long time. But let's say the first intervention with the annexation of Crimea in April 2014, and then, as I said, the first military intervention in Donbass in 2014, later that year, essentially was in reaction to the signing of that association agreement in late 2013, right? And for me, it's more about, there was no alternative for Ukraine. Ukraine basically had 20 odd years of development in this no man's land between East and West, and it wasn't working, right? Putin was managing and controlling Ukraine's subservience and its underdevelopment economically through oligarchs and the corrupted kind of political system. And there needs to be fundamental change, right? And Ukrainians understood through Euromaidan that the country needed a clear direction and an anchor, and that was EU accession, right? And ultimately, this is more about, Ukrainians want to live in a normal country, a European country with values. And that's what it's about. How can you in a way compromise on that, right? I mean, I always used to cite the data. If you go back to 91, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia's GDP per capita was about the same. It was about $3,000 a capita. By 2013, Russia and Poland was 14,000. Ukraine was still 3,000. Why was that? I mean, Poland had the EU accession anchor. Russia was a commodity resource exploitation model, and obviously with the commodity cycle that helped the $14,000. But Ukraine was nowhere, right? It had, it was this bridge between East and West simply wasn't working for Ukraine, wasn't working for Ukrainians. It was unstable. It was unstable as reflected by the fact there were two revolutions, right? Orange Revolution, Euromaidan. And then if something hadn't happened with Euromaidan in 2013-14, it would have happened again later down the line, right? So I don't think there's anything the Ukrainians could have done differently that would have changed the historical outcome or the outcome in terms of this was an affront to Russia and Putin, who wanted to dominate and control Ukraine. Ukraine was trying to pull away from that because it had to for the country to develop economically, and Russia, Putin struggled to get over that, right? I mean, that's the reality.
Tim, do you think the recent Abu Dhabi discussions among representatives from the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine about the war produced any tangible positive results?
Look, I'm very skeptical, right? I mean, I think, you have a Trump administration that fundamentally doesn't understand Ukraine, doesn't understand Russia, doesn't understand, the explanation I just gave of why this conflict ultimately is happening. You have a country that wants to pull out of Russia's orbit because its previous position wasn't working, right? And so, and I think the Trump administration thinks giving Russia a bit of territory and cutting a business deal will somehow resolve this. No, I mean, Russia and Putin wants to dominate the whole of Ukraine. Whatever deal, if it's done, whatever deal is forced down Zelensky's throat, I have no doubt at all that Russia will not keep to that deal. Russia will, Russia's hope is that this process that Trump is pushing will see a deal that is so unpalatable to Ukraine, that undermines its defenses so much, that it sows political and social instability in Ukraine and leaves the defenses of Ukraine open for further Russian attack, right? So, I mean, that's the complication. And I think Ukrainians understand this, right? But they're in a position where they are still dependent on the US for significant military supplies, air defenses, or air defense missiles, all those kind of things. And they are forced to play along with this charade, this ridiculous process. And Putin himself is, I think is, lots of things we can do to make Russia serious about these negotiations. That involves increasing the costs on Russia. But Trump is not willing to do any of that, increasing military supplies to Ukraine to increase the military costs to Russia, increasing sanctions to increase the economic costs. But I think Putin is encouraged by all the stuff that Trump does to undermine the Western alliance. The Greenland stuff, backing far-right parties in Europe. I think Putin thinks that if he carries on this war just a bit longer, ultimately Trump will unravel the NATO alliance sufficient that its support for Ukraine will crumble, and it will give him the opportunity to go in and take the rest of the country. Again, make no mistake. It's a read my lips kind of moment. Putin wants the whole of Ukraine. He wants to subjugate the whole of Ukraine. He sees Ukraine as in his sphere of influence. He spelled it out in that essay he wrote in mid-21. He sees the collapse of the Soviet Union as this catastrophe in the 20th century. He will not stop until he gets the whole of Ukraine, unless he is stopped. That is the harsh reality. So, long-winded answer to your question. This is a charade of a peace process. I think both the Russians and the Ukrainian side are playing Trump as long as they can for different interests. And if there is a peace deal agreed, if Ukraine is forced to agree a peace deal, I think it's very unlikely to be sustainable ultimately.
Tim, is there anything Ukraine should be doing now to bring the war to a close?
Well, it's doing as much as it can do in the situation it's in, right? I mean, the question. I mean, look, in the end, if part of the issue, I guess, at the moment in terms of peace negotiations is there a territorial settlement or deal that could satisfy Putin, and if Ukraine agreed de facto loss of some territory, can it be assured enough that the security backstop from the West will be sufficient to stop Putin going in again? Again, I'm absolutely crystal clear that whatever Putin accepts in this deal, that is not what he would view as the final settlement, right? It's base camp towards getting something else. So I don't think you can trust Putin. The question for Ukraine is, if they settle on what Trump seems to be pushing them, which is surrender of Donbass and those frontline defenses, can Ukraine be assured that the US and the Western allies will come in behind Ukraine and support it if, as I think is inevitable, Russia doesn't keep to that agreement and attacks in the future? And I'm afraid, given Trump's period in office, first term and now, I don't think Ukrainians can be assured that Trump would do that. I don't think, everything we've seen is Trump brown-nosing Putin, doing everything to appease Putin. As I said, not particularly imposing any sanction or costs on Putin. So I would be very nervous if I was the Ukrainians about accepting a deal that would undermine their defenses in the short term, if they have to give up those fortress defenses in exchange for some kind of vague security, assurance from this administration. So I think the best strategy, which is I think what it probably is to play along with this peace process as long as possible. In the meantime, hope that Europe and itself are able to fill those gaps in its defenses potentially left by the Americans, for a position in the future where Ukraine may well have to walk away from a very unpalatable deal that I think Trump and Putin may well want to impose on Ukraine.
Tim, we're just about out of time, but I do have a final question. Do you think Ukraine will actually join the EU in 2027, as President Zelensky has suggested?
Look, I mean, this, as I said, in a way, this was all about the EU accession anchor going back to the Euromaidan in 2013-14. It's critical for Ukraine's successful development, right? What marks out countries in Central and Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, in their very, very successful developments over the last 30 years almost, is that they had an EU accession anchor. A date was given when they would join. They knew what they had to do. They got on with it. They changed laws and the regulatory environment to deliver on that agenda. And that was a great signal for international business to come and invest in those countries. Ukraine's never had that. So I think it's really, really important. I think it's possibly over-optimistic to think 2027, but I think a date has to be given. Again, what we saw with the Copenhagen Treaty in 1994, which basically green lighted membership for the first wave of emerging European countries in 2004, if you remember, was the specific date that was given. International business and actually policy elites in countries subject to the accession process don't really take the whole process seriously unless there is a specific date. So I'm less worried about whether it's 27 or 30, but it's critical that it's a date. It's a specific date that tells Ukrainians if they tick the boxes in terms of economic reforms and regulatory reforms, they're in. I think now it's clear to Europe that Ukraine is the front line of defense for Europe, because I don't think Europe's able to defend itself without Ukraine. And so it's critical that the Ukrainian economy is provided with a sufficient anchor, that Ukraine is self-sustaining on an economic basis. It's able to sustain its own defense economically. I mean, that could happen, if the country has a clear EU accession path. And, we see Ukraine ultimately benefiting from the same sort of accession process and investment process that was driven by, having a firm date.
Tim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Mike, great to speak to you.
I have been speaking with economist Timothy Ash, an associate fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House in the UK, and a senior sovereign strategist at RBC Blue Bay Asset Management in London. This episode of Krynytsia is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. And I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia. Until next time, that's all for now.